Anyone can be a podcast guest, even your mum, but that doesn't mean they'll actually be any good when they come on your show. Ideally, you want industry-leading experts with big online followings who will not only promote your show, but help it grow as well. Talking to guests has always been one of the cornerstones of podcasting, from Joe Rogan to Russell Brand and Mark Maron. Basically everyone seems like they're doing an interview show these days. But increasing numbers of founders, CEOs, and business leaders are starting to see the benefits of podcast interviews as well, and that's for a few different reasons. Firstly, obviously, it's a platform to promote yourself and your business. Second, you can use a podcast to grow a personal brand. It's also really good for building up momentum and engagement on social media. And lastly, something that not a lot of people think about, but hosting a podcast is a great way to get a lot more high quality backlinks to your website. But the process of actually finding, screening, and booking guests can be a challenge in and of itself. So before you do anything else, ask yourself, what kind of guests do you want? How will you convince them to appear on your podcast, and where are you going to find those guests? Firstly, figure out what kind of guest you want. Ideally, the guest should be suited to the nature of your podcast. So it's no good having a health expert talk about dietary routines on a true crime show. It just doesn't fit. Second, try to convince them to appear in your show, because they're not going to come on without a good enough incentive. They're busy people and they've got a lot of stuff in their calendar. So you need to lay out the benefits of coming on your podcast in a compelling and personal way. So if your show is about pets, you could invite a vet on the podcast, and not only will they offer sound advice to your audience, but they'll also be able to reach a network of potential customers themselves. So that's the incentive for them to come in your show. Lastly, you need to have a process for finding guests. Obviously, the internet is useful, but there is no Facebook for podcasters, or at least there wasn't until recently, because thanks to Matchmaker.fm, that's all changed. Basically, Matchmaker.fm is like Tinder, but for podcasters. It lets you connect, discover, and start talking to like-minded people who are into podcasting, all within the one platform. It's completely free to join, and Matchmaker is a thriving community with loads of interesting guests and podcasts that are just a quick message away. All you have to do is fill in a few details about your show and browse a constantly growing database of guests, and you can then just book the most relevant ones to appear on your show. Once a guest accepts your invite, you can then just book them in to record on your show. So basically, Matchmaker does all the boring work for you. It saves you the time and effort of having to troll through the internet to look for podcast guests, here, there, and everywhere. However, if you prefer to take a more hands-on approach, then here are a few different strategies you can try out to get your first podcast guests. Firstly, you should think about trying to find podcast guests that have something to say or sell. This is well known in podcasting. Basically, anyone who's just released a new book or released a new product that's relevant to the audience of the podcast, they're the kind of people that are keen to come on shows like yours, because they have a product or a book or whatever it is to sell that will be of interest to your audience. So you'll get their expertise on your platform, and then the guests will have an opportunity to pitch whatever it is they're selling to your audience. But in saying that, nobody likes a hard sell. So you shouldn't let your guests pitch their product or service on your podcast endlessly for minutes, because listeners will just switch off. You need to be a bit more subtle than that. So if you do want to pitch a product or let your guest promote their book, you need to try and weave it organically into the conversation. Another thing to think about if you're interested in finding good podcast guests is to attend events and really get out there and network and meet with the kinds of people who are likely to make really good guests on your show. So the chances of actually landing a good guest and getting that all important yes from them increases phenomenally when you're actually talking face to face to them. We all know it's very easy to ignore an email from a sender that we don't know, but if you're in person talking to someone and you've built up a rapport with them, then you can just ask them if they'd be willing to be in your podcast, and you'd be surprised how many people will just say yes. People tend to feel more confident when they can get a sense of who you are as a person and what you're trying to achieve with your podcast. So here in the UK, there are plenty of podcasting events. You can go to meet like-minded people who are into podcasting as well. And I'm pretty sure it's not just the UK, it's all over the world. There's likely to be podcast meetups in your area. So whether that's talks on starting a successful podcast, like a kind of workshop type event, or if it's to pick up some new skills related to podcasting, there's loads of events going on worldwide that you can be in the same room as lots of other people who are kind of doing the same thing as you. So a couple of worldwide events worth checking out are obviously Pod Summit. That's massive. That's one of the biggest events on the podcasting calendar. And there's also another event hosted by Rain News, which is a really big one in the podcasting community. But there's also loads more. And all you really need to do is just quick search on Google for podcast networking events near me or something along those lines. And you should find plenty of stuff in your area that other podcasters are attending. Lastly, if you're looking for guests, you should also consider searching for similar podcasts. So podcasters focusing on similar topics to the focus of your show, they'll naturally know the type of content that your listeners are likely to enjoy. So they'll obviously just make a great fit for your show, and it won't take much work to get a great episode out of them because they're experienced and because they have the knowledge that will be of interest to your listeners. And again, if you want to get podcasters on your show quickly, you can do that using Matchmaker. All you have to do is choose a category, find the perfect show, and drop the host a message. And if they're interested in appearing on your show, they'll message you back, and then you can just arrange a time to record from there. Again, it's just really easy on Matchmaker because that's what the whole process and the platform is set up for. On the flip side of that, you can also use Matchmaker to get yourself in front of new potential listeners by appearing as a podcast guest yourself. That's one of the best ways to kind of organically grow your podcast audience. By appearing as a guest on other shows, you'll be exposed to a whole new audience. And if those people like what you have to say on that particular episode, they'll be more likely to come back and check out your podcast and look into you in more detail and check out the previous episodes that you've recorded. So if you found a range of different guests, maybe you've made a list or a spreadsheet of all the different people you'd like to have on your show, you need to keep in mind that you're not going to get a yes from everyone. The guests won't appear on your show if they don't feel like they're getting anything in return. That's just human nature. They're not going to go out of their way to do all this work for you if you're not giving them something back in return. So as a podcaster, it's your responsibility to try and make the benefits clear from the get-go. You need to spell out why people should come on your show and why that's an attractive prospect for them. So obviously, when it comes to attracting guests on your show, one of the main ways to do that is to just have a massive audience, because if you have really high download numbers, there aren't many guests who will say no to appearing on your show, because obviously that's an attractive proposition. But all podcasters have to start off somewhere, and you're not going to have huge download numbers right out of the gate. So if you are new, it's best not to put the emphasis on your download numbers, but you should find other ways that you can display the value that appearing on your show can offer. So that might be like growing a mailing list or something else other than download numbers. So if you are a founder or a CEO, or if you started a podcast for a business, you likely already have an email list of people that you can contact. Maybe it's previous customers or people who have engaged with your marketing material. Basically, the more emails you have on the list, the better, because you can then go to the guest and say, look, if you record an episode with me, I'll publish your episode and send it out to everyone on my email list. And that's not download numbers per se, but it's definitely still an attractive prospect for any guests who want to come on your show and maybe promote something. Another thing to consider, and this is something that not a lot of podcasters often think about when approaching guests, but it's backlinks. So basically, if you run a company podcast and your podcast is hosted on your website and your website has a decent domain authority, then whichever guest comes on your show, they'll benefit directly from that, from a backlink on your website to wherever it is that they want to point people, whether that's to their latest book or to their own website, to their own company. Basically, a backlink from a high domain site is definitely worth having, and it's an attractive thing for a lot of potential guests. A more obvious way of pitching to guests is relying on your social media following. So basically, how many followers do you have on Twitter? Do you have lots of followers on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram? It doesn't matter what the platform is, but it goes without saying that the higher the numbers, the better the chances you'll have of getting quality guests, because basically that signals that you have a bigger audience who are willing to listen to what you have to say. So if you do run a company podcast, or you're a founder or a CEO, and you do have a kind of decent following on social media, that's definitely something you should be pushing when you're approaching potential guests. So how should you actually contact the guests that you found that you want to have on your show? Well, places like Instagram and LinkedIn are a great way to find guests, and you can contact them on there as well if you want to. However, be aware that they can be a bit limiting. So Twitter, for example, has a character limit of 280. Email is still king when it comes to contacting podcast guests, because it doesn't have all those restrictions that social media platforms tend to have. So if you want to reach out to potential guests, we would strongly advise going with email, because it's time and time again proven to be one of the most effective ways to reach people. But with that in mind, you need to be careful of how you craft your emails, because if you write paragraphs and paragraphs of text explaining to the guests why your show is so great and why they should come on it, realistically, they're probably not going to read that. So you need to keep things short, sweet, and concise. And you can get your point across quickly. You don't need to have reams and reams of text. Just be careful that you're communicating in a polite and courteous way. Try to keep it simple, and you can follow an example just like this one that's on the screen now. And when you do reach out to people via email, one thing to be careful of is sometimes there can be a lot of back and forth email ping pong between you and the guest, trying to nail down a time to record. So that's why it's important, and we recommend including a link to a service like Calendly or Harmonizely in your first email, so that the guest can simply click on that straight away and book in a time slot that works for them. So you cut out all that email back and forth, trying to find a day that works for both you and them. So finding and booking guests used to be quite challenging. Well, not really challenging, but there's a lot of different steps in the process, and basically it can be a big time sink. If you have to go on Google, research the guests, listen to the ones who would be a good fit for your show, think about how you're going to pitch to them, it's a long process and it can eat up a lot of time. That's why Matchmaker has streamlined the whole process to basically cut out all that inefficiency and make it much easier to get in contact with people who want to be on your show. So when someone logs on to Matchmaker, they can quickly glance what your show is all about and decide whether it's right for them. And also they can check out previous episodes, have a listen, see if they like the feel and sound of your show. So if you want a quick and easy way to discover literally hundreds of guests who are eager to be in a podcast just like yours, then head over to matchmaker.fm. You can sign up for free using your LinkedIn, Facebook, or your Podcast.co account, and you can start making new podcast connections today.